The local patch here just released an article about a Alexandria man who is 34, or at least was, meeting a young girl online who was 14, carrying on a 2-year relationship with her, which resulted in her becoming pregnant and then going to her house subsequent to that for some time later and having sex with her as well. It doesn't say much more than that. It doesn't say anything about the parents. It doesn't say anything about why he wasn't up on charges before. But somewhere along the line, the article is silent about this. He was up on charges and sentenced by an Alexandria judge. They never mention who the judge is, of course, but there are only a couple of circuit court judges in the Alexandria Circuit. Lisa Bonder of Kemmler being the chief judge, who often loves to take these cases. Judge Clark is another one, and they may have a third that I think they just added. They also have some substitute judges, but the bottom line is this man got 12 years, and got me thinking. There's another one, a young Korean man who is certainly currently serving a sentence in one of the Virginia prisons. He also got 12 years for having consensual sex with a 17-year-old. What's interesting is that the man who impregnated the 14-year-old met her online and was not part of a sex sting or anything like that. Perhaps on a dating app, it didn't say. But apparently the girl was willing to go along with all this for some period of time. The 17-year-old was willing to go along with this too until they broke up, in which case it all hell broke loose. He too got 12 years. So it got me thinking, as a reminder, those of us who are studying this issue, at least anecdotally, have found that there are lots of cases where non-contact offenses are getting 20 and 30 years and more. They have over their head 150 years, 300 years even, versus the actual contact offenses, which are getting between 8 and 12 oftentimes. And the question is why? Why? There's a weird understanding, apparently, that somewhere in the Sentencing Commission, that attempting to do something is far worse than actually going through. If you attempt to do it, we have to stop that. We have to throw the book at you. But if you slip through and actually commit a sexual offense with a real person, well, we'll give you, 10 years or something, right? I'm looking here at the mandatory minimum penalties for sex offenses in the Federal Crime Commission's 2016 study. And some interesting things came out here. They talk about sexual abuse offenders accounting for only 3.5% of the federal prison population, which is fairly large, but pales in comparison to the states and their prison population. And the number of sexual abuse offenders in the federal prison has steadily increased, though, since 2004. So only a very small number of people incarcerated are sex offenders, so defined in this broadest possible way. Don't forget, that's their term for it. Those convicted of a sexual offense are anywhere between peeing in the forest and actually touching a child. I've had people say, well, the former are very small by comparison. Remember, we're dealing with a label and as much as a statistic. That label is very powerful, and it does not mean what the public thinks it means, okay? So we look here too. What's interesting here is 1,600 offenders in 2004 is now up to 5,764 so-called offenders in fiscal year 2016. So even though it's only 3.5% of the total population in the federal prison, it is on the rise. Child pornography, interestingly enough, accounts for about 5.1%, but the number of child pornography offenders in federal prison has steadily increased since 2004, from 1,259 offenders in that year to 8,508 by fiscal year 2016, right? A 12-year difference. The number of offenders convicted of a child pornography offense carrying a mandatory minimum also increased from 118 to 6,303, 6,303. And the mandatory minimum is 5 years, generally speaking. What's curious about these stats is that the person who got receipt of child pornography received a 2.5-year longer sentence, approximately 85 months on average, than the average sentence length for a possession offender. So if you were, I suppose, the person who was going to send it, you received a lesser offense than the person who actually received it. And I'm sure the logic there, which is 55 months on average compared to 85, the logic there is if you requested it and you brought it in, well, that's worse than if you actually produced it yourself, which is very odd because it would seem to me that what would be worse is actually getting the producing it to begin with, especially when you consider that the group that does a lot of these analyses has determined that just because you received the child pornography and you looked at child pornography, that doesn't necessarily mean that you're going to commit some kind of violent offense. This would be RAIN, RAIN, and statistics for perpetrators of sexual violence is very, very curious. They say that there's a large number of people who have something like 97% who have been convicted of a sex offense, do not commit another one. And they followed this over 9 years. In one study I read, I believe it was by the, I'm trying to remember now, I believe it was the Department of Justice Bureau of Justice Statistics. And they looked at 9 years, and most people did not commit another offense. Of course, I'm constrained to point out, what does it mean to commit an offense? According to the police, when they do their proactive stings, anybody that they weave a crime around is a sex offender. There is no distinction mentioned at all. At all. There's simply no at all. Okay. Let's see. Yeah, I'm looking for a couple of items that I had here. 12% of all state inmates were incarcerated as punishment for sexually violent crimes. And of course, you have to understand too, some places, if you have meth in a school zone, that is considered to be a sexually violent offense. Okay? In only 11% of rape and sexual assault cases did the perpetrator use a weapon. Again, we really have to drill down on understanding what constitutes a sexual offense. What does that mean? We don't really have any idea. It is unconscionable that we are lumping everything together and assuming that there is no distinction. That's how the statistics are looked at. They're not disaggregated by violent and nonviolent, by sex stings, by, as I've said before, urinating in the forest, flashing somebody, peeping in a window, or violent sexual assault are all treated essentially the same in terms of statistics and often in terms of sentencing. As we've indicated, we have people here in Virginia who have 35 years plus for a non-contact offense. They get so many per alleged conversation. So if you're very talkative, you got a lot more than if you weren't. So let's see, we have since the 1990s, individuals convicted of sex crimes, this is according to the Sentencing Project, have been subjected to an increased use of incarceration and longer sentences. At the same time, it's interesting that I've read an article too that said judges are pushing back on this and giving less harsh sentences for child pornography claims below sentencing guidelines. This pushback from judges, apparently, though slow, is reflecting the problematic nature of the crime, the problematic issues having to do with various child pornography claims, and perhaps reflective of the fact that possession and receipt are apparently viewed quite differently, although police are happy to add distribution in there as well. In many cases, we have seen people have received something, sometimes that the police have sent them, and they now have receipt, possession, but they add distribution because they argue that this person created it or would create it or whatever, and they get that as well. And for those of you who want to argue against me, well, demonstrate where that isn't happening, okay? Because I keep pushing back on some of it myself and on some of what you claim, and it's easy to throw around attacks, but why don't you actually demonstrate it? That would be nice too. The standard is always on us to demonstrate or prove or what have you. Okay. Recidivism rates also come into this picture by the Sentencing Project, and they have declined by roughly 45% since the 70s. And this, of course, points to that major meta study that I have previously mentioned from 2024, which talks about how it is just clearly the case that they are on the decline. All of these are on decline. This article is written by Kristen Budd. She's a PhD and researcher with the Sentencing Project. And it's just very, very interesting to note that you have even people like Mrs. Jacob Wetterling, the Wetterling child's mother, who says what we need is lesser victims. And we would all agree, but we have to agree also on who the victims are. They're not all children. Some of them are people who have been caught up in these things, who gin up these statistics, who have been lumped together with others as if they were the same type of crime. So that's just a little bit about statistics, a little bit about how they are not as revealing as people think. Rather, they reveal deep-seated inequities in the system and how one actually categorizes an offender and a victim. This is Norman Michael Asian, ICAC Unpacked, for the 8th day of November, 2024. Have a good day.